Welcome to a very special radio edition of YTV's Everybody Has a Story. I'm your host, Cody Pomeranz, along with YDN reporter Finnegan Schick, and it is our honor to welcome the guest for this week's show, the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Since leaving office, President Carter has worked tirelessly on human rights issues through his foundation, the Carter Center, and his efforts have earned him a Nobel Peace Prize and a Presidential Medal of Freedom. President Carter has written more than 24 books, including most recently A Call to Action, Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. And he joins us today to talk about the issues highlighted in that book. Mr. President, thanks so much for being with us.
It's good to be with both of you.
What inspired you to write this book? Was it a specific story or statistic that was the tipping point?
Not really. It wasn't a specific thing that caused me to write the book. We've been working in 80 different countries for the Carter Center ever since I left the White House. And I've began to see around the world, my wife and I visited 145 countries, as a matter of fact, a few more. I began to see around the world that women and girls were treated quite despicably in some cases, sometimes with direct abuse, and quite often with deprivation of equal rights. For instance, if a family is very poor and they have boys and girls, the boys go to school and the girls don't. The boys get the best food and the girls don't. The boys have a chance to prepare for a career in the future and the girls don't. And quite often those girls are sold into, I'd say, marriage slavery, sometimes as early as 8 or 10 years old, to a much older husband, just arranged by her parents, when she has no choice over it. So we began to see this all over the world. And so for the last 3.5 years, the Carter Center has concentrated our human rights effort just on analyzing this particular question and is trying to ascertain what causes people in different countries, including the United States, to treat women as inferior to men and to treat them differently. We found, as the title of my book says, concerning women, religion, violence, and power. And I would say that the misinterpretation of Holy Scriptures by different major religions, both in Christian areas and also in Islamic and Buddhist areas, relegate women to a secondary position of importance. Also, the trend of the world lately in the last few years toward more and more acceptance of violence, including in the United States, also contributes to this problem, and they struggle for power. If men are in power, they don't want to share it with women. So these are the things that causes this abuse, and so it's been over a long period of time that my interest in this subject has been aroused.
The subtitle for your book, as you said, is Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. How do we separate the aspects of religion that are at the root of these problems from the aspects that are healthy?
Well, we've done that the last 2 years at our conference by bringing into the Human Rights Annual Session top religious leaders, both in the Christian world and also in the Islamic world and so forth, to share with us what their basic beliefs are concerning the relationship of men and women in the eyes of God, whichever God is worshipped by the particular religious leader. And so that's one of the very, very important things. For instance, I was a very active and devoted Southern Baptist until the year 2000, when Southern Baptist Convention leaders as a matter of fact, it was in Florida, voted that women could no longer be treated as equals to men, had to be subservient to men, and the women would no longer be permitted to be pastors in the church or deacons or chaplains in the Army or Navy and so forth. And also that if a woman taught classes in a Southern Baptist seminary, they were not permitted to teach if there was a boy in the classroom along with girls. So because of that, primarily, Rosa and I decided to withdraw our affiliation with the Southern Baptist. And as you know, in the Catholic Church and some others, it's ordained that a woman cannot be a deacon or a pastor in a church, although men can do so. So that is a fairly prevalent thing in the Christian religion. The Muslims, by the way, the top leaders of the Muslim faith are not quite so strict. For instance, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University Egypt. They have about 120,000 students in that university. But he's a accepted spiritual leader of most of the Muslims in the world, all the Sunni Arabs. And he is cooperating with me in the presentation to his believers that women should be treated with complete equality. But some local Muslim leaders do treat women as inferior.
I know you wrote a letter to Pope Francis, and he responded. Yeah. Were you encouraged by his response, and do you think that it's possible that we'll see female priests in the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, the answer to the first question is yes. As the next question is probably no. I sent him a copy of my book, as I did all the other top leaders in the world. I sent out about 200 copies to the heads of state, of governments, and I included him. And I wrote him a letter and urged him to consider the propositions that I addressed in the book and to help me with them if he would. He sent me a letter back that was encouraging. He didn't mention female priests, but he said his opinion was the women should play an increasingly important role in the Catholic Church in future years. So I think that women are going to be given more authority within the Church in some councils, but I don't believe that it's likely in the next 10 years for women to be ordained as priests by the Pope and his cardinals.
Well, you talked about your religious roots, and I know you grew up in the Deep South in a very religious family. Were you always attuned to this discrimination, or did you have to overcome some of the views and stereotypes of women that you talk about in your book?
Well, in the book I saw a direct relationship between the racial issue, that is between black and white, as I do nowadays between men and women. I grew up in a completely segregated society. I lived in a little community called Archery, about 2.5 miles from Plains, Georgia. And we were the only white family there. All of my playmates were black kids. And we treated each other as complete equals when we were very young. We wrestled each other, fought each other, fished with each other, worked in the fields together, and so forth. But later, I began to realize as I grew older that the law of the land then, for about 100 years, as a matter of fact, from the 1860s to the 1860s to the 1960s, was separate but equal. It was ordained by the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the American Bar Association, and all the religious leaders as well. But it was separate but not equal. And I began to realize later on that black people could not serve on a jury. They were not given a right to vote in Georgia. They were given inferior schools and that sort of thing. And really, the first time I saw a complete integration of the black and white races was when I was in the Navy and President Truman ordained that there'd be an end of racial segregation in the military forces of all kinds. And so it was a slow evolution of my realization that white people, even those that were very liberal in their attitudes, enjoyed the benefits of whites being superior to black people and getting better jobs and better education and that sort of thing. And that's the same thing that perpetuates discrimination against women now, because men, even those men who don't want to see women treated as inferior, a lot of us enjoy the privileges of being treated as I'd say, first-class citizens when women are treated as second class.
Now, you mentioned some truly horrifying statistics in this book. What happens when you disaggregate this data by age or race? What specific groups of women are bearing the brunt of these injustices?
Well, in two specific cases, the little girls bear most of the brunt. For instance, female genital cutting, or some people call it circumcision, some call it mutilation. For instance, in a nation like Egypt, this process is forbidden by law. But 90% at this moment, 90% of all the females living in Egypt have had their genitals mutilated by a so-called cutter, a senior woman who, with a razor blade or something, removes all the external parts of a woman's genitals. And sometimes they even sew up the orifice so that they can only urinate or later on menstruate. Well, anyway, this is done just to little girls, usually when they're, I'd say, under 5 years old. And that needs to be changed, of course. In fact, the United Nations General Assembly, on 2 occasions, has passed resolutions outlawing it. But in the countries like Somalia and Djibouti, 97% of all the females have had their genitals cut. And in about half the countries in Africa, more than 50% have done so. That just applies to young, very young girls. And then when they get a little bit older, I mentioned already earlier, so 8 to 12 years old, 15, 16 years old, little girls are sold into slavery as brides, quite often to men who've already had 2 or 3 wives and still keep them. And the little girls, when they first go there, are looked upon as servants in the house, and then when they get up older, the husband claims his rights, conjugal rights to have sex with them. So you see that when girls are young, they're horribly persecuted. When women get older, they're deprived of religious equality that you've already described. And quite often, they suffer from so-called honor killing. Honor killing is when a young woman in a family, or say a daughter, might even be raped by a stranger. And the rest of her parents, the rest of her family considers that to be a disgrace on the family. So they actually kill the girl because she's been raped, which brought disgrace on the family. And quite often, most often their husbands or an uncle does it. Sometimes their mothers do it. And increasingly, young boys who are their brothers do it. So this goes on as well. In our country, for instance, we still have discrimination against women. I'd say in the universities like Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Emory University, where I've taught now for 33 years, women are sexually abused, and the fact is, as proven by the U.S. Department of Justice, that most of the rapes on college campuses are perpetrated by just about 3 or 4% of the male students who know when they get to college they can get away with it. So this goes on very broadly, both in the universities in America and also in our military forces.
Well, you bring up Yale and you bring up elite universities, and you've said in the past that presidents of these universities don't want to talk about the issue of rape and sexual assault because it besmirches the reputations of the universities. What would you say as a professor of someone who has been on a college campus for more than 30 years, what would you say to Yale President Peter Salovey about how to tackle this problem?
Well, I don't want to say any particular person out, but let's just take the example. It's been highly publicized in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the University of Virginia, which I also consider to be an elite university. In 2012, a young freshman girl was raped in a fraternity house by 7 men, and she reported it to the officials of the University of Virginia, and that was in 2012. Nothing was done about it. The girl was discouraged from making it a public issue. And it was only 2 or 3 weeks ago that Rolling Stone had a highly publicized article about it, and now, of course, finally, after 2 years, the University of Virginia is beginning to take some action to investigate and to put fraternity houses on probation until the holidays are over and things of that kind. So this goes on everywhere. In fact, the statistics are that 41% of all the universities in America have never reported a case of sexual assault in the last 5 years. I don't know about Yale, but I know that both Harvard and the Emory University, where I teach, are now both on a watch list by the U.S. Department of Education because of a violation of Title IX, which guarantees equality of treatment for women on college campuses.
You also talk about the congressional inaction on these issues.
Yes, that's right.
President Obama just announced sweeping executive action on immigration. Are there executive powers that he can and should be leveraging with these issues?
Well, I think so. There are executive powers that he could exert, and there are also has the so-called bully pulpit where he could speak more forcefully on it. I'm not criticizing President Obama because I think all his predecessors have been equally guilty of looking the other way. But there are things that can be done. And as a matter of fact, earlier this year, as you may know, New York Hillary Clinton tried to get the military policy changed. The reason that there's so much sexual assault in the military and also in universities is because the leaders don't want it to be known that under their command these crimes are taking place. And she particularly addressed the problem in the military. The Defense Department reported earlier this year that in 2012 there were 26,000 cases of sexual assault that they know about. Of those 26,000 cases, only 310 people were ever punished for these crimes. That's just a little bit more than 1%. And the reason is that commanding officers of a ship or a military company or battalion, they have the legal right to say whether or not the crime should be investigated and the offender or the criminal punished. And the commanding officers, like college presidents, don't want it to be known that on their ship or in their Marine battalion or Army company that these crimes take place. So the military commanders stop the investigation and discourage the abused person from making any issue of it. So these are the kind of things that under the purview of our federal government, including the president and also the Congress.
Well, Hillary Clinton is certainly the perceived frontrunner for the Democratic nomination in 2016. Do you think she's the right person to champion this cause?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the 2016 election, but I would say that I think that Hillary Clinton feels the same way I do about the deprivation of equal rights for women. I know she made a very fine speech a number of years ago, I think when her husband was president, when the United Nations had a conference on women's rights in Beijing, China. And I read her speech at the time, and I've read it since then, and she made a very strong and forceful speech about the right of women to be treated equally. So yes, I would say that Hillary Clinton would represent a strong voice on this subject.
Well, certainly she'll have to deal with a lot of foreign policy issues that remain after President Obama leaves office should she be elected. The U.S. seems to have a double standard on human rights, especially with countries like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. How do we reconcile our foreign policy interests with our human rights goals?
Well, when I was elected president, I espoused in my inaugural speech two things. One, to maintain peace, and the other one was to protect and increase human rights, and I emphasized that very strongly throughout my term in office. Any president, though, has to accommodate other issues as well. You can't have human rights be the only criterion by which you judge or deal with other countries. And there's no doubt that the United States has now slipped backward in I'd say, observing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As you all, I know both of you know, that was adopted by every member of the United Nations, which owned about 45 countries back in 1948, and it comprises just 30 very brief paragraphs that spell out the highest possible, I'd say, secular moral values of humankind. And of those 30 paragraphs, right now, I would estimate that the United States is violating 10 of them. Some of them deal with privacy of citizens that has been brought about by the intrusion of intelligence agencies into private affairs of citizens, and others are the violations because part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights always equates men and women to be treated exactly equally. So we have a long way to go in our country, but we still have a voice with which we can express our condemnation of gross abuses of human rights in other countries.
Well, millions of students across the country are going to be graduating college in May. About 1,300 of them are going to be coming from Yale. What should these students do? Should they look for opportunities in nonprofits and NGOs, or private business, or local, state, and federal government? Where can they make the most impact?
Well, obviously each graduating student is going to be prepared for a particular role in life in the future, whether they have studied education or science or mathematics or engineering, or whether they studied law and so forth. So I think that would be the natural avenue for them to go into a career. But I get this question often from students at Emory University who are approaching graduation or who've already graduated. And I advise them, if you don't have any specific opportunity for a job when you graduate from college, I would advise you to go into the Peace Corps. I think no matter what you want to do in the future, whether you go into commercial affairs like with a major corporation in America, or go into a law firm, or go into politics, or go into education, 2.5 years or so that you spend in the Peace Corps will be a very good preparation for future life, and also will be a wonderful addition to your curriculum, right, where people look at your career and say, this person qualified to serve under me if they are in the employment stage. So I would say do whatever suits you best, and if you go into a non-profit organization for benevolent purposes, that's wonderful. If you want to be a pastor, in a church with religious affairs, if you want to be a lawyer, whatever. But if you don't have any clear concept, then consider the Peace Corps. My mother was in the Peace Corps, and also my grandson was in the Peace Corps. Mother was in India, and my grandson was in South Africa, so I know a lot about the Peace Corps.
Well, we always end our Everybody Has a Story interviews with a speed round, which is just some quick, fun questions. So the first one is, who has been the most influential woman in your life that's not a relative or a spouse?
Well, I would say that most recently, two women with whom I serve as a so-called elder. One of them is a former president of Ireland named Mary Robinson, who's now, by the way, in charge of the United Nations efforts to deal with global warming. The other one is a former Prime Minister of Norway, who later was a head of the World Health Organization, named Gro Brundtland, and she serves along with me as well. So I would say those two women right now are the ones that I admire and try to emulate in many of the things that I do.
Number two, who would you rather hang out with, Anwar Sadat or Menachem Begin?
I'd rather hang out with Anwar Sadat. I found that of all the 65 or 70 international leaders with whom I was acquainted as president, he was the most compatible with me. We enjoyed being together. Our two wives were very close to each other. Our children and even grandchildren got to know each other before Sadat was assassinated. So I would say that Anwar Sadat would be the top leader with whom I'd like just to spend a few hours.
Number three, there are currently 5 living U.S. presidents. Which one of you would win at Trivial Pursuit?
I would guess that probably Obama would. I think he would probably know more about Trivial Pursuit. He would probably know who was the first president born in a hospital. That would be me. And he'd probably know some of the other Trivial Pursuit questions that relate to more current events.
All right. Well, I'm sure Bill Clinton's not going to be very happy with that answer.
Well, they might be highly competitive.
Was it harder being president or a peanut farmer?
Both of them were hard, tedious work, and I would say that being president was probably harder because the responsibilities were more diverse. Peanut farming is pretty easy to learn if you practice it. You just plant the peanuts, you cultivate them so they'll grow good, then you harvest them and sell them. But there are 1,000 things to do when you're president every week. So I'd say being president was more difficult.
And because you were a peanut farmer, do you prefer chunky or smooth peanut butter?
I personally like chunky, but my wife likes smooth, so I would say we buy more smooth than we do chunky.
Jimmy Carter served as the 39th President of the United States. The book is a call to action, and it's on the shelves now. President Carter, thanks for speaking with us.
Pleasure.